Thank you. It is an honor to be here today. How many of you have ever seen or heard or read Democracy Now? Fantastic. Well, we're going to be handing out flyers to you that show you where you can see us or hear us in your community on radio and television. As State Senator Gottfried said, it's the largest public media collaboration in this country. We started on a few dozen community radio stations as the only daily election show in public broadcasting in 1996, and then have grown to hundreds of radio and TV stations, I think because of the hunger for independent voices. They are what are going to save us. You are what is going to save us, is hearing this tremendous surge of new ideas as the candidates go state to state running for president. I don't look particularly at the number of one Democratic presidential candidate versus the other in the caucus or the primary in a state, or the Republican candidates that are running as well. I just add them together. We have never seen anything like this. The number of people this year that are getting involved, from the young people like those that are here, and it's amazing to see hundreds of people, I mean, right here in these rooms, going to be making phone calls, going to be protesting outside the state legislature. This is the hope. No matter what your beliefs, when you start getting vested in making a difference, knowing you can, that's when we're not only going to change our community, our state, our country, but we're going to change the world, because we must recognize we come from the most powerful country on earth. Every little thing you do has a ripple effect that is felt everywhere. Now, it's very interesting to come up to Albany from New York City and learn that this largest family planning gathering of activists that takes place each year only larger than the one before, takes place in a building called The Egg. I'm sure you can use that somehow. But it's also wonderful to come up in a train through this historic state that we live in, a state to be so proud of. The level of activism, from women's rights activism to civil rights activism, embodied no better than in the people of, for example, Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth, who in 1851 gave that famous address, Ain't I a Woman, in which she said, that man over there says women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And ain't I a woman? Look at me, she said. Look at my arm. I've plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I've borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? She asked. And then she said, that little man over there, he says women can't have as much rights as men because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Sojourner asked. She said, where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. But you think what it took to buck the system then. This remarkable woman who was an abolitionist, a minister, an ex-slave, a women's rights activist. And you think about another activist at that time, Frederick Douglass. He, too, had been enslaved. You know, Frederick Douglass, though made his home in Rochester, his remarkable newspaper, the North Star, came from the eastern shore of Maryland, from a small area near St. Michael's. And he was given over to what is known as a slave breaker because of how strong he was. The man was named Edward Covey, and he lived in a place called Mount Misery. Fortunately, Frederick Douglass, as Covey tried to break him, broke away, headed north, and to truly change the world. But that property today, Mount Misery on the eastern shore of Maryland, is owned by none other than Donald Rumsfeld. He bought it in 2003 to be next to his dear friend, Vice President Dick Cheney, who lives down the street. Mount Misery. But Frederick Douglass came here to New York to set up his press, to speak out against slavery and for women's rights. Right there he was in Seneca 160 years ago in 1848, standing with the women's rights leaders saying, these two fights for freedom are inextricable. And let's remember as we go out, as citizens, as journalists, as people who care about each other, protecting each other, what Frederick Douglass said. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has, and it never will. It is so important today in 2008, this seminal, pivotal, groundbreaking year, to know what a difference you can make, and to look at the movements that have come before us that fuel us in this place we are today. As I was preparing for our Democracy Now! Broadcast this morning, talking about reproductive health care, talking about the history of the women's rights movement, and ending with young people who've come from around the state, the peer counselors, I went back to a Democracy Now! Broadcast of October 23rd, 2001. It was about a month, 5 weeks after the September 11th attacks, after the terror that we all know well that took down over 3,000 people in New York and Washington. We were broadcasting on that day, September 11th, just blocks from where the towers of the World Trade Center once stood. Yes, we have known terror in this state. But on October 23rd, I began the broadcast talking about the postal workers, one after another, who were dying from the anthrax attack. And we ended the show with a doctor, a man named Dr. Leroy Cartwright from Bellevue, Nebraska, a retired Air Force lieutenant colonel, who had just sent an open letter to President Bush, to Attorney General Ashcroft at the time, demanding protection for abortion providers in the United States. His case had gone to the Supreme Court. This was 2003 that we were talking to him. He said, when we look at terror, we have to have the same definition. When we look at terror abroad and abhorring any situation where innocent lives are taken, and then looking here at home, when you look at the strong women and men who have fought for reproductive freedom and have risked their own lives. Now, that year, 2003, was the day that James Kopp was convicted for the murder of Barnett Slepian, again just down the road in Buffalo, who in 1998 lost his life to a sniper's bullet because he dared simply to stand up for women and ensure that they would have their freedom. These are all dates, people that we have to remember, because it makes everything you do so much bigger than the action you are involved in yourself. You're part of something so important.